The Burrow was never silent. Harry had understood this within his first hour of arriving 2 summers ago. Understood it the way you understand something not by being told, but by simply standing inside it long enough to feel it as fact. The house made noise the way old houses do, yes, with its creaking staircases and settling walls. But it was the other noise that defined it. The particular, layered, overlapping sound of a family that had long ago stopped measuring how much space it occupied. Molly's voice, carrying from the kitchen before breakfast had properly begun. The twins' footsteps on the landing, never quite in sync, always in conspiracy. Ron's complaints rising up through the floorboards. Ginny's light, purposeful tread on the stairs. Arthur's morning cough, soft and apologetic, as though he felt guilty for waking the house, even while the house was already awake around him. Harry lay still for a long moment, listening. Nothing. He opened his eyes. The ceiling of Ron's room was the same as it always was, low and sloped and plastered with Chudley Cannon's posters, the players mid-dive on aging paper, their colors faded to something closer to rust than orange. Ron was asleep in the bed across the room, one arm hanging off the side, his mouth slightly open. The window above his bed showed a sky that had not yet decided what color it wanted to be, gray fading at its edges into something pale and almost golden, the particular light of a summer morning that hadn't fully committed to itself yet. Harry sat up slowly. The silence continued. Not a hostile silence, nothing like Privet Drive's silence, which always had teeth in it, which always meant something was being withheld or monitored or disapproved of. This was softer than that. This was the silence of a house that had simply, for once, forgotten to wake up on time. And yet it unsettled him in a way he couldn't immediately account for, the way you sometimes feel unsettled by a door left open that is always closed. Not afraid exactly, just aware that something had shifted, and uncertain whether the shift was meaningful. He checked the clock on Ron's nightstand. Early, earlier than he'd woken on any morning since arriving at the Burrow a week ago. He dressed quietly, not wanting to disturb Ron, and eased the bedroom door open with the particular care he'd learned at Privet Drive, the care of someone who had spent years trying not to exist too loudly inside a house that did not entirely want him there. It was a habit he was still unlearning. The Burrow did not require it, he knew that, but the body remembers what the mind is still working through. The landing was empty. He stood at the top of the stairs for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the uneven banister, and listened again. Below, the kitchen was dark, or nearly dark, just the thin, early light coming through the windows of a sink. No smell of toast. No sound of the wireless. No Molly moving between the stove and the table with the brisk, purposeful energy that Harry had come to associate with mornings in this house, as completely as he associated mornings here with the smell of eggs and the distant clucking of the chickens in the yard. He looked toward the end of the landing, where the door to Molly and Arthur's room was closed. Still closed. He looked toward Fred and George's room. Closed. Ginny's room. Closed. The Weasley family clock hung at the top of the stairs, as it always did, its 9 golden hands arranged in the slow overlap of a family at rest. Harry had looked at it many times over the past week, had felt something he could not quite maim each time he did. Something adjacent to longing. Something adjacent to relief. Now, in the thin morning quiet, he looked at it again. All 9 hands pointed to home. Not one of them trembled toward traveling or work or any of the more alarming sectors of the clock's face. Every member of the Weasley family was, at this moment, exactly where they were supposed to be, The clock said so, with the calm certainty of something that had never once been wrong. Harry read this, as he had always read it, as a kind of permission. He descended the stairs. The kitchen was cool in the way that kitchens are cool before they have been woken by cooking. A leftover coolness borrowed from the night that would be entirely gone within the hour. Harry moved to the table and pulled out a chair, and the sound of the chair legs on the stone floor was startlingly loud in the quiet. He sat, folded his hands on the table, looked around at the kitchen he had come to know well enough that he could have described it with his eyes closed. The deep stone sink, the collection of mismatched mugs hanging from hooks above it, the enormous pot that always seemed to be in the process of being cleaned or about to be
filled, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the window above the garden that let in the light in long rectangular panels that moved as the morning moved. There was nothing dramatic about any of it. That was, Harry had come to understand, precisely the point. He had been in this kitchen during the chaos of a full Weasley breakfast, which operated at a noise level somewhere between a Quidditch match and a moderate natural disaster. He had been in it during the quieter hours of an evening, when Molly sat near the wireless and Arthur spread his muggle objects across half the table with the focused joy of someone who had never lost the ability to be fascinated. He had eaten here more meals than he could count over the past week, and in each of them he had been aware, not uncomfortably, but constantly, that this was a thing being offered to him, this belonging, and that it was not something he had been given before, and that he was not entirely sure yet how to hold it without either gripping it too tightly or dropping it through inattention. This morning, alone in the quiet kitchen, he simply sat with it. He noticed, after a moment, the papers on the table. They were on Arthur's side, the end of the table nearest the window, where Arthur always sat, where a permanent deposit of parchment and muggle curiosities and half-finished cups of tea had established itself over years of daily use. Harry had not paid much attention to Arthur's papers before, had absorbed them as part of the general texture of the Burrow's surfaces without looking closely. But this morning, in the quiet, in the early light, his eyes drifted there and stayed. The papers were ministry issue. He could tell from the seal at the top of the visible page, the familiar deep purple of official ministry parchment. They were not hidden, not folded away. They sat in a loose stack, the top page visible, the heading legible from where Harry sat. Security Assessment, Preliminary Notes, Large-Scale Outdoor Gatherings, Summer 1994. He could read the first line of text beneath the heading without moving from his chair. He did not read it. This was not a dramatic decision. It did not feel, in the moment, like a decision at all. More like a small, internal gesture, a slight turning away. The papers were not his. The information on them was not for him. Whatever the ministry was assessing or preparing for, it was Arthur's business, ministry business. And the fact that it was sitting unguarded on a kitchen table at this early hour was simply the consequence of Arthur being Arthur. A man who trusted the people in his house, who had never felt the need to hide his work from his family, who would not, Harry suspected, have minded particularly if Harry had read the whole page. But Harry did not read it. He looked away from the papers, back toward the window and the garden. Outside, the gnomes had not yet woken, or were at least not yet visible, which was as close to peaceful coexistence as gnomes ever managed. The garden was still and damp-looking, the long grass catching the light. A few chickens moved in the yard beyond. Harry sat with his hands on the table and watched the morning arrive. He felt, in this moment, something he recognized but could not quite name. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness felt too large and too loud for what this was. Something quieter. Something that had to do with a clock upstairs, with all its hands pointing home, and the papers on the table that he had chosen not to read, and the kitchen that smelled faintly of last night's dinner and dried herbs, and the particular warmth of a house that held many people and did not particularly care whether it was tidy. He belonged here. Not permanently, not without question. He was a guest in this house, a fact that he held without resentment. It was simply true, and the truth of it did not diminish anything. But this morning, in the quiet, before the house had woken and the day had made its demands, Harry Potter sat in the Weasley kitchen and felt that he was, at minimum, someone this house was glad to contain. It was not a small thing. He heard the first footstep on the stairs, light, deliberate, unbothered by the quiet, and looked up toward the kitchen doorway to see who the morning had decided to send him first. Ginny came first. Harry had half expected Ron who complained about oversleeping even as he did it, who would have stumbled downstairs grumbling about the unfairness of early mornings, while simultaneously being unable to remain in bed past a certain hour. But it was Ginny who appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, a book tucked under her left arm, with the ease of someone who carried books the way other people carried keys. Not as an accessory, not as a statement, simply as a thing one did not leave behind. She saw Harry at the table and did not appear surprised. "You're up early," she said. It was not quite a question. "So are you," Harry said. She considered this for a moment, as though checking it against some internal record, then gave a small nod that seemed to acknowledge the point without granting it any particular significance. She moved to the window seat, the long cushioned bench built into the wall beneath the kitchen's south-facing window, where the morning light came in at the best angle, and settled herself into it with the practiced ease of someone who had claimed this spot so many times that the cushion had developed a memory of her. She opened her book. She did not speak again. Harry found this unexpectedly comfortable. He had half braced for conversation, for the particular social pressure of being alone with someone in a quiet room, the unspoken obligation to fill the silence with something. But Ginny appeared to have no interest in filling anything. She simply read. The morning light lay across the pages of her book and across her hands, and she turned pages at irregular intervals, and the kitchen remained quiet in a way that was no longer unsettled, but simply inhabited. Harry looked out at the garden. The gnomes had appeared, 3 of them at the far edge of the vegetable patch, moving with the low, purposeful waddle that seemed to constitute gnome locomotion. Not going anywhere in particular, as far as Harry could tell, but going there with considerable commitment. One of them appeared to be carrying something, though from this distance it was impossible to determine what. Another had stopped completely and appeared to be staring at the house with the flat, incurious expression that gnomes deployed as their primary response to most situations. "They came back," Harry said. "They always come back," Ginny said, without looking up from her book. Ron degnomed the garden on Tuesday. By Thursday, they'd all moved back in. Dad thinks they've got a tunnel system under the compost heap. She turned a page. He finds it interesting. Does Ron? Ron, Ginny said, in the tone of someone delivering a considered verdict. Does not. Harry almost smiled. He turned back to the garden. The morning was brightening steadily now, the pale early light giving way to something warmer and more committed, the kind of light that meant the day had made up its mind and intended to be fine. It came through the kitchen windows in long, unhurried panels and moved slowly across the stone floor as the sun moved, and Harry tracked its progress without thinking, the way you track a slow thing when the room is quiet enough to notice it. He heard the stairs creak. Ron arrived the way Ron generally arrived at things, slightly off balance, slightly aggrieved, and entirely committed to making his presence known. He appeared in the doorway in his
dressing gown, his hair doing several things at once, his expression carrying the particular blend of confusion and complaint that was Ron's characteristic response to waking up in circumstances that differed from his expectations. He looked at Harry. He looked at Ginny. He looked at the kitchen, which contained no breakfast, no Molly, no sounds of anything being prepared. His expression deepened. "Why is no one making breakfast?" he said. "Because no one is awake yet," Ginny said. "You're awake?" "I'm reading." Ron stared at her for a moment with the look of someone who finds this response categorically insufficient, then transferred the stare to Harry, apparently seeking solidarity. Harry offered a small shrug. Ron's stare returned to the kitchen at large, sweeping it for evidence of breakfast that might have been overlooked. There was none. He pulled out the chair across from Harry and dropped into it with the full weight of someone who has resigned himself to disappointment, and folded his arms on the table and looked at the garden with an expression of profound injustice. "The gnomes are back," he said. "Ginny mentioned," Harry said. "I spent 45 minutes on Tuesday," Ron said. He did not elaborate. The 45 minutes apparently contained its own complete argument. He stared at the gnomes with the flat, focused look of someone cataloging a grievance, and the gnomes, oblivious as gnomes reliably were, continued their slow circuit of the vegetable patch without any apparent awareness that they were being resented. "You could go and denome again," Harry suggested. Ron turned to look at him. The look was long and expressive and communicated, without words, that this was not a serious proposal and Harry should be aware of that. Harry acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. Ron turned back to the garden. Ginny turned another page. The morning continued. It occurred to Harry, sitting in the kitchen with Ron slumped across from him and Ginny reading in the window light, that this was, in its way, pleasant. Not in any remarkable sense. Nothing was happening. Ron was irritated about gnomes. Ginny was reading. The kitchen was cool and quiet, and slightly untidy in the familiar Burrow way. And there was no breakfast yet, and the morning was still early. And none of this amounted to anything that could be called an event. And yet, Harry was aware of something in the room that he could only describe as ease. The particular ease of a space where people have been comfortable with each other long enough that they no longer need to perform it. He had not grown up in rooms like this. He was aware of that fact the way you were aware of a sound that has only just stopped. In its absence, suddenly conscious of how present it had been. Privet Drive had taught him many things about how houses worked, and none of those lessons included this. Rooms at Privet Drive were for appearances, for the management of impressions, for the careful maintenance of a surface that would satisfy whatever audience the Dursleys were imagining at any given moment. Even in the absence of guests, the performance never quite stopped. Even alone, the house felt watched. The Burrow had no such anxiety about itself. It was crooked and overfull and constitutionally incapable of presenting a tidy surface. And it did not try. Things were stacked where they had been left. Chairs were pulled out at angles. The herbs hanging from the ceiling beams had been there long enough that they had become part of the architecture. The clock at the top of the stairs tracked 9 people across a set of possibilities that included mortal peril. which said something about the kind of life the family had collectively accepted as normal. And yet the house was entirely at ease with all of it. Harry was still thinking about this when the stairs creaked again. Not the single deliberate creak of someone trying to be quiet, but the rapid double creak of two people descending simultaneously, which at the Burrow could only mean one thing. Fred and George came into the kitchen the way they generally came into rooms, as a unit, as a weather event, as something that changed the atmospheric pressure slightly upon arrival. They were both dressed, which in itself suggested they had been awake for some time, and they were conducting a conversation in the low, quick murmur that served as their operational register when they did not particularly want their conversation to be accessible to others. Fred was carrying something. It was small enough to fit in one hand, and wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of what appeared to be ordinary kitchen string. It sat in Fred's palm with the stillness of an object that was not doing anything yet, which was a distinction Harry had learned in the context of Fred and George to pay attention to. They noticed Harry and Ron at the table. Fred's eyes moved to the wrapped package in his hand, then back to Harry, with the brief flicker of someone rapidly reassessing a situation. "Morning," George said to the room generally. "Morning," Harry and Ron said. Ginny said nothing. She turned a page. Fred and George moved to the far end of the table, the end nearest the back door, which Harry had noticed was their preferred position in most rooms. Whether by habit or by instinct for proximity to exits, he had never been sure. They sat. The low, murmured conversation continued for a moment, and then Fred set the wrapped package on the table between himself and George, and they both looked at it. And then George said something very quietly, and Fred nodded. Ron was watching them with the resigned wariness of a younger brother who had learned through long experience to treat quiet as a warning sign. "What is that?" Ron said. "Nothing," Fred said. "It's wrapped up." "Many things are wrapped up, Ronald. That's what wrapping is for." "What's in it?" "Nothing that concerns you." Ron stared at the package. The package sat on the table between Fred and George and did nothing of note. It was, from any objective perspective, just a small, wrapped parcel. It could have contained anything. It looked, on the surface, like the kind of thing that would turn out to be entirely unremarkable. Harry had been around Fred and George long enough to know that this particular surface was worth questioning. Fred looked up from the package and caught Harry's eye across the table. His expression shifted, not quite to the particular smile that meant a joke was in progress, but to something adjacent to it. Something that was gauging a response before committing to a request. "Harry," Fred said in the tone of someone about to ask a favor that they had already decided was reasonable, "hold onto this for a moment, would you?" He held the package out across the table. Harry looked at it. It sat in Fred's outstretched hand, small and brown-wrapped and tied with kitchen string, and it appeared to be entirely inert. It made no sound. It did not move. It was, as far as Harry could tell, just a package. "What is it?" Harry asked. "Just something we're working on," George said. "For the shop," Fred added. This was the phrase that Fred and George used as a general-purpose explanation for all the things they were in the process of developing. For the shop, which had not yet become a shop, which existed primarily as an idea and a set of increasingly elaborate prototypes. And Harry had heard it enough times that it had ceased to function as an explanation and had become instead a kind of category. The category being things that are technically products but may currently be in an unpredictable state. "It's not going to do anything, is it?" Harry said. "Probably not," Fred said. This was not, Harry reflected, the same as no. But Fred was still holding the package out across the table, and his expression was open and easy and entirely without guile.
or at least without the kind of guile that Harry associated with setups, with jokes that were aimed at specific people. And it was early, and the kitchen was warm, and the morning was quiet and good, and Harry did not want to be the thing that introduced complication into it. He took the package. It settled into his palm with the ordinary weight of a small, wrapped object. He set it on the table in front of him. It sat there. "Thanks," Fred said, and turned back to George, and their low conversation resumed. Harry looked at the package. It was still sitting on the table, doing nothing, which was exactly what an ordinary small parcel would do. He set his hands flat on the table on either side of it and looked out at the garden instead, where Ron was, still staring at the gnomes with stored resentment, and Ginny was still reading in the window light, and the morning was still arriving in long, pale panels across the kitchen floor. After a moment, very faintly, so faintly that he was not entirely certain he had heard it at all, the package hummed. It was a small sound, a brief sound. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds and then stopped. Harry looked down at it. The package sat on the table in front of him, wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen string, doing nothing. He did not say anything. He looked out the window at the garden, where the gnomes were still going about their business, and he thought, briefly and without resolution, that he probably should have asked what was in it before he agreed to hold it. Arthur Weasley came downstairs as though he were slightly surprised to find himself doing so. This was, Harry had come to understand, simply how Arthur moved through the world, with a quality of
mild, genuine astonishment at his own good fortune, as though each morning he woke up and discovered, freshly, that he had a house full of people he was glad to know, and a job that allowed him to spend his days in proximity to the things that fascinated him most, and that this continued to strike him as remarkable rather than routine. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his weekend clothes, old trousers, a slightly too large jumper with an unraveling cuff, his hair doing something independently minded at the back, his expression carrying the sheepish warmth of someone who has overslept and knows it, and cannot quite bring himself to be as sorry about it as the occasion probably warrants. He looked at Harry and at Ron and at Fred and George at the far end of the table and at Ginny in the window with her book. His face moved through several things at once: the brief flicker of a parent conducting a head count, the slightly broader warmth of finding the count satisfactory, and something else, something quieter underneath the rest that Harry could not quite name but recognized.
"Morning," Arthur said to all of them and to none of them in particular. "Morning, Dad," said Ron. "Morning, Mr. Weasley," said Harry. Ginny raised a hand from behind her book without looking up. Fred and George said morning in unison without interrupting their conversation. Arthur moved to the stove with the gentle purpose of a man who has made tea in the same kitchen for many years and requires no particular guidance from the kitchen to do it. He filled the kettle. He found his mug, a large, chipped thing with a Ministry of Magic crest that had faded almost entirely, and set it on the counter with the comfortable familiarity of returning something to its proper place. "Your mother still asleep?" he asked, of no one specifically. "Haven't heard her," Ron said. Arthur nodded, slowly, as though receiving and processing a mild and pleasant
surprise. "She was up late," he said, "organizing things." He did not specify what things. In the Weasley household, this required no specification. Molly was always organizing things, and the things were always in a state of requiring it, and the system was self-sustaining in the way of all systems built by people who find the work itself satisfying. He waited for the kettle with his hands in his pockets, looking out the window at the garden. After a moment his gaze landed on the gnomes, still conducting their unhurried circuit of the vegetable patch. "Ah," he said, "they're back." "Yes," Ron said with feeling. "Remarkable creatures,"
Arthur said, in the tone of genuine interest that he applied to almost everything. Completely untrainable, you know. No capacity for deterrence whatsoever. Most magical creatures can be discouraged from a territory if the conditions become sufficiently unpleasant. Gnomes simply don't retain the association.
By the time they've made it back to the tunnel, whatever discomfort they experienced has been entirely reclassified. He watched one of the gnomes stop, look at nothing in particular, and then continue walking in exactly the same direction. There's something almost admirable about it. Ron stared at his father. "Dad," he said, "I threw that one into the robin's hedge on Tuesday." "Did you?" Arthur said with mild interest. "It bit me." "They do," Arthur agreed sympathetically, and turned back to the kettle. Harry had been watching Arthur since he came downstairs, with the particular attention he paid to things he was still learning. It was not an uncomfortable attention. He was not studying Arthur the way he might study a difficult bit of transfiguration theory, with the pressure of an exam somewhere in the background. It was quieter than that. More like the attention you give a thing you want to understand because you find it genuinely worth understanding. Arthur Weasley was not like any adult Harry had spent significant time around. Dumbledore he admired enormously, but Dumbledore operated at an altitude that made ordinary comparison difficult. Professor McGonagall he respected with the particular respect reserved for people who would not permit anything less. The Dursleys had taught him a great deal about adults, but none of it applied here in any way he could map. Arthur was something different from all of them. He was a man who found things interesting, who had not, as far as Harry could tell, ever lost the capacity to be genuinely curious about something new, who treated Harry's Muggle background not as a deficiency to be apologized for or a curiosity to be managed, but as an actual source of information, a window into something he wanted to see more clearly. Harry found this, even now, slightly extraordinary. The kettle boiled. Arthur made his tea, found the milk, checked it with the brief professional suspicion of someone who has opened Weasley refrigerators long enough to be cautious, and brought his mug to the table. He sat in his usual chair at the end nearest the window, nearest his papers, and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the table with the comfortable blankness of a man settling into morning. His gaze passed over the papers without stopping. Harry watched him not stop. The papers were still there, the same stack, the same ministry seal visible at the top, the same heading that Harry had read without meaning to and then looked away from. Arthur apparently did not notice that they had been left out, or noticed and did not particularly mind. He looked at them the way you look at things that belong to you, without really seeing them. Harry said nothing. He looked at the package on the table in front of him instead. It had not hummed again. It sat in its brown paper wrapping with the placid inertia of an object that had decided to behave, at least for the time being, and Harry left it where it was and turned his attention back to Arthur. "Harry," Arthur said, with the particular brightness of a man who has just remembered something he has been looking forward to, "I've been thinking about your aunt and uncle's house." Harry blinked. "You have?" "Specifically about the electrical system." Arthur set his mug down and leaned forward slightly, the posture he adopted when a theory was incoming. "Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I know I sometimes get the terminology muddled. But the lights in a Muggle house run on something called a circuit, yes?" "That's right," Harry said. "A circuit," Arthur repeated. "Current traveling in a loop, continuous flow. And this current passes through the
The wires in the walls, yes? From what they call the fuse box. The consumer unit, some people call it, Harry said.
Arthur's expression shifted briefly to something very close to delight. Consumer unit, he said. Marvelous. And from there it travels to each individual plug socket and light fitting throughout the house. He paused. Now, a plug socket delivers a fixed voltage. In Britain, 230 volts. I looked this up. I have a pamphlet somewhere. Dad, George said from the far end of the table, without looking up from his conversation with Fred. You have 17 pamphlets. 18, Fred said. 18, Arthur agreed. The point is, 230 volts, continuous, available at any socket in the house at any moment. He looked at Harry with the expression of a man about to make a conceptual leap and wanting company for the journey. Now, a broomstick, as you know, is enchanted at source. The charm is in the wood. It responds to the rider's intention. But what I've been wondering, purely, theoretically you understand, is whether electricity, properly directed, could serve as a medium for a continuous enchantment. Harry opened his mouth. Not a replacement, Arthur said, raising one hand. Not instead of the wood charm. As a supplement, an amplifier, the way Muggle hearing devices amplify sound without creating it. The sound is already there. The device simply makes more of it. He picked up his mug again. I wondered whether an enchanted object connected to a circuit might draw on the electrical current to sustain the enchantment without the usual fading. There was a pause. Harry considered it genuinely, because Arthur was watching him with the attentive interest of someone who actually wanted to know what he thought. That might work. I mean, the current is always on, isn't it? As long as the house has power. Arthur pointed at him. Exactly. As long as the house has power. The problem, Harry said, thinking it through, is that electricity doesn't it would go through metal wiring fine, but if the broomstick is wood… Conduction, Arthur said immediately. I thought about that. What if the contact point were embedded? A small fitting just at the handle. It'd probably set the wood on fire, Ron said. There was a moment of silence. Yes, Arthur said. That is the primary obstacle. He looked at his tea. I've been trying to work around it. Ron pulled a napkin toward him across the table and held it out to his father. Draw it, he said. Arthur's face brightened considerably. He produced a pencil from somewhere. Harry had never entirely worked out where Arthur kept his pencil, but he always had one, and began sketching on the napkin with the focused energy of a man who has been waiting for exactly this invitation. Harry watched Arthur draw his diagram and listened to him explain it, and felt the morning settle further into itself around him. Ron making occasional skeptical noises, George suggesting at one point that the answer might involve rubber tubing, Fred pointing out that rubber tubing might solve the conduction problem, but would create an entirely different set of problems. Arthur absorbing all of this with genuine interest and modifying his sketch accordingly. The light through the kitchen windows had shifted. It was warmer now, more golden. The early pale uncertainty resolved into something clear and confident. The gnomes had retreated, or at least were no longer visible. The kitchen smelled of Arthur's tea and the dried herbs from the ceiling and the faint background warmth of a house that has many people in it, even when those people are mostly still asleep. Ginny turned a page in her window. The package on the table, in front of Harry, sat still and quiet. Harry thought, briefly and without resolution, about the heading on Arthur's papers. Security Assessment. Preliminary Notes. Large-Scale Outdoor Gatherings. Summer 1994.
He turned the phrase over once in his mind, the way you turn something over to look at its other side. And then he set it down again. He had not read further. He did not know what the assessment said, or what gathering it concerned, or what the ministry was planning. He knew only what the heading told him. He looked at Arthur, who was explaining to Ron why rubber tubing was, in fact, not as straightforward as George had suggested, his pencil moving across the napkin with cheerful persistence, his tea going slightly cold beside him. Harry said nothing about the papers. The morning moved on. The second hum was not faint. Harry noticed it at the precise moment Arthur finished explaining why rubber tubing, while theoretically sound as an insulating material, presented its own category of difficulties when introduced to an active enchantment. Something to do with the way rubber interacted with charm work at a molecular level. A theory Arthur had developed independently and was fairly confident about, though he acknowledged he had not yet found a way to test it that did not risk the rubber. The package hummed. It was brief, briefer than the first time perhaps, but distinctly less quiet. A low, contained sound, somewhere between a vibration and a note. The kind of sound that a thing makes when something inside it is in the process of deciding whether to continue being contained. Harry felt it as much as heard it, a faint resonance in the table beneath his hands, and he looked down at the brown paper parcel with the particular attention of someone who has been trying not to think about a thing and has just been reminded that the thing is still there. The parcel sat on the table. It did nothing further. Harry looked up. Fred and George were still at the far end of the table, their conversation now conducted in tones so low they were less a conversation than a set of shared glances with occasional words attached. Arthur was still explaining rubber tubing to Ron, who was now staring at the napkin diagram with the expression of someone who has been drawn into a technical discussion against their better judgment and cannot identify the moment at which it became too late to leave. No one appeared to have noticed. No one except Ginny. She had not looked up from her book. Her eyes were still on the page, her posture still the composed, settled posture of someone engaged in reading. But Harry had been in this kitchen long enough that morning to know her silences, and this silence was different from the reading silence. This was the silence of someone who had heard something and was deciding, with deliberate calm, whether to acknowledge it. She turned a page. Harry looked back down at the package. The question, he was aware, was straightforward. He could take the package to Fred and give it back, which was what a person who had thought about it clearly would probably do. The hum, twice now, the second time louder, was not the behavior of an object that was simply sitting inertly on a kitchen table. It was the behavior of an object that was doing something, or preparing to do something, or in the early stages of having done something that had not yet fully expressed itself. Harry knew enough about magical objects to know that the distance between humming quietly and something significantly more dramatic was not always as large as you hoped. He could give it back. He could say, simply and without making anything of it, "Here, I'd rather not hold this. I think it's doing something." And Fred would take it, and that would be that, and the morning would continue. This was the clear option. Harry looked at Fred and George. They were deep in their low conference. Fred with his elbows on the table, George with his chin in one hand. Both of them apparently arrived at a point in their discussion that required concentration. There was about them the focused stillness of people working through something with precision, which was, Harry had learned, the mode Fred and George entered when they were genuinely trying to get something right rather than simply enjoying the attempt. They looked, in this moment, less like people who had handed a potentially unpredictable object to someone across the table, and more like people who had temporarily set aside all considerations not directly relevant to the problem in front of them. They had, Harry suspected, forgotten about the package entirely. This was not a comfort. He thought about interrupting them. He constructed the sentence in his mind. "Fred, I think this is doing something. You should probably take it back," and measured it against
The morning, against the quality of the quiet that had been in this kitchen since before anyone else came downstairs, and against something less straightforward than either of those things. Something he could not quite articulate. But that had to do with not wanting to be the person who introduced a problem into a space that had, up to this point, been entirely without them. The morning had been good. That was the truth of it, the simple truth underneath everything else. The morning had been still and warm and genuine, and Harry had sat in the middle of it and felt, with a clarity he rarely allowed himself, that he was exactly where he wanted to be. Arthur's diagram was on the napkin. Ginny was reading. Ron was complaining about gnomes with the comfortable frequency of a complaint that did not require resolution. Fred and George were doing whatever Fred and George were always doing, which was building something, always building something, in the particular way of people who cannot quite stop. And Harry had been sitting in the middle of it, holding a package he had not asked about, because the morning was good, and asking about it would have introduced something, and he had not wanted to introduce anything. He looked at the package. He could still give it back. "You're staring at it," Ginny said. She had not moved. Her eyes were still on her book. She had not, as far as Harry could tell, looked up at any point during the last several minutes. She said it with the same tone she had used earlier. Not quite a question, not quite an observation. Something that occupied the space between the two. "It hummed again," Harry said, keeping his voice low. "I heard. Should I?" "That depends," Ginny said, turning a page. "On whether you know what it is." Harry paused. "I don't." "Did you ask?" "Fred said it was something for the shop," Harry said. Ginny was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same as knowing what it is," she said, in the tone of someone making a distinction they consider important. Harry looked at the package. He looked at Fred and George. He looked back at the package. "It's probably fine," he said. Ginny said nothing. She turned another page. This silence was different again from all the previous ones. It was the silence of a person who has made a point and is leaving it exactly where they put it, without embellishment, because they are confident it will do its own work. It did. Harry picked up the package. It was warm, not dramatically warm, not the heat of something actively combusting, nothing alarming, but warmer than the table had been, warmer than the air in the kitchen. A gentle, persistent warmth that an inanimate object wrapped in paper and string had no particular reason to have. He turned it over in his hands. It was light. Whatever was inside was small and light and warm and had hummed twice. He turned it over again. On the underside of the package, he noticed something he had not seen before. The kitchen string was knotted at the bottom rather than the top, which was unusual because packages were generally tied from the top. And the knot was tight and purposeful in a way that suggested someone had wanted it to be difficult to undo. Not impossible, but not easy either. He was not going to open it. He set it back on the table. He thought about the trace.
This was the thing he had been not thinking about since Fred had handed the package across. The thought he'd been keeping at the edge of his attention without quite letting it into the center. He was 14 years old, and it was summer, and he was outside of school, and the Ministry's trace on underage magic was, he had learned this the hard way in the summer before second year, entirely indifferent to whether the magic had actually been performed by the underage wizard in question. It detected magic in the vicinity of underage wizards. That was all it did. It did not ask who had done it. If the package did something, if whatever was inside it activated, if it produced a detectable magical effect here in the Burrow kitchen, the trace would record it. And the trace, recording it, would see Harry. He knew, rationally, that Fred and George were also in this kitchen, that the record would show multiple wizards present, that the Ministry was unlikely to pursue anything further in a household full of adult wizards. He knew this. But he also remembered the letter, the formal Ministry letter that had arrived the summer before second year, informing him that he had performed magic in the presence of muggles, and that any further violations would result in expulsion from Hogwarts. He remembered reading it in his room at Privet Drive, the particular cold weight of it. He remembered that the letter had been wrong. The magic had been Dobby's, not his, and that being wrong had not prevented the letter from arriving. The Ministry's trace was not a careful instrument. He looked at Fred and George. They were still deep in their conference, utterly absorbed. The small, focused world of their project apparently not yet including any awareness that the thing they had handed to Harry across the table had now hummed twice and was sitting warm in his hands on the table in front of him. Harry set the package down on the windowsill. He did it without thinking about it very carefully. Or rather, he did it at the moment when thinking about it carefully had started to feel like a reason to keep holding it, which seemed wrong. He simply stood, took the 2 steps to the windowsill, set the package there, and sat back down. He looked at it on the windowsill. It was still there, still wrapped in brown paper, tied with kitchen string, sitting in the morning light, with the composure of an object that had not asked to be anywhere in particular, and was entirely content with wherever it ended up. Harry put his hands flat on the table. He had not given it back. He had not asked what it was. He had moved it from one surface to another, which was not the same as either of those things, and he was aware of that. The awareness sat in him with a mild but persistent weight, the weight of something he had chosen not to resolve. Across the room, Ginny turned a page. She did not look at the windowsill. She did not look at Harry. She was reading, or she appeared to be reading, and the morning light lay across her hands and the pages of her book, and the kitchen was still quiet. And Harry looked at the package on the windowsill and thought that he had probably handled that as poorly as he could have without it being actively his fault. Which was, he recognized, a way of thinking about things that did not reflect particularly well on him. The package sat in the light. It did not hum again. Not yet. Molly Weasley, on a normal morning, was a force with a direction. Harry had observed this enough times to understand it not as metaphor, but as practical fact. She entered rooms the way weather systems entered valleys, with purpose, with momentum, with the immediate and total transformation of whatever atmospheric conditions had existed before her arrival. Pots moved, plates appeared, the wireless found its station, chairs were straightened and surfaces cleared, and the ambient noise level of the kitchen reorganized itself around her presence the way iron filings reorganize themselves around a magnet, drawn into a pattern that had not existed a moment before. This morning, she came downstairs differently. Harry heard her on the stairs, a slower descent than usual, the particular tread of someone still in the process of waking rather than already fully committed to the day. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her dressing gown, her hair not yet pinned, her expression carrying the soft, slightly unfocused quality of someone who has overslept and is still negotiating with that fact. She looked at the kitchen. She looked at the people in it. Something moved across her face, quick, unguarded, gone before it fully formed. But Harry caught it. It was the expression of a woman who had expected to come downstairs to a kitchen that needed her, and had found instead a kitchen that had, somehow, managed. "Oh," she said, "you're all up." "Morning, Mum," Ron said. "Morning, love," Arthur said without looking up from the napkin diagram, which had by this point expanded to cover most of the available napkin and was threatening the table's surface. Molly stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she usually did. Her eyes moved around the room with the practiced sweep of someone who has managed a household of 9 for long enough that the survey is involuntary. Taking in Ron at the table, Harry across from him, Fred and George at the far end, Ginny in the window, Arthur and his napkin. The sweep lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It was, Harry had come to understand, enormously thorough. Then she stepped into the kitchen and became immediately and completely herself. "Arthur, you haven't eaten anything. Ron, sit up properly. Fred, George, whatever that is, put it away before breakfast." She was already at the stove, already filling the kettle that Arthur had emptied for his tea, already reaching for the large pan that lived on the second hook from the left and nowhere else, already in the motion of a morning that had been slightly delayed but was not, on that account, going to be conducted any differently from any other morning. "Mum," Fred said, "we haven't got anything." "I've got eyes," Molly said, in the tone that closed that particular conversation. Fred and George exchanged a glance of the kind that communicated a great deal in no time at all, and then became, with the practiced ease of long experience, entirely innocent in their posture and expression. The low conference was suspended. George put his hands on the table. Fred straightened in his chair. Harry watched this with the mild admiration he always felt for Molly's ability to produce immediate behavioral results through the deployment of about 6 words and a specific tone. It was, he had concluded, a form of magic that operated entirely independently of a wand. "Harry, love, have you had anything?" Molly asked, without turning from the stove. "No, not yet," Harry said. "Ron?" "No." "Ginny?" "No, Mum." "Right." The pan went on the hob. 20 minutes. The kitchen resumed. The quality of its resumption was different now from what it had been. Warmer, louder, more inhabited, the particular density of a room that has acquired its organizing principle. Arthur put his pencil down and picked up his tea, which had
gone cold, and looked at it with the mild philosophical acceptance of a man who has lost track of hot tea before and expects to do so again. Ron sat up slightly straighter, the straightening lasting approximately 90 seconds before gravitational forces reasserted themselves. Fred and George remained in their state of performed innocence. Ginny read. Harry sat with his hands on the table and felt the morning shift around him. Not worsen, not improve, simply shift. The way light shifts when more of it enters a room. Everything the same, and everything slightly different. He did not look at the windowsill. He looked at the windowsill. The package was still there, sitting in the full morning light now, the paper slightly golden in it, the kitchen string casting a thin shadow. It was doing nothing. It had not hummed since he moved it. It sat on the windowsill, with the composed stillness of an object that had decided, for the time being, to be unremarkable. And Harry looked at it
and then looked away. Molly moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone operating on a familiar system, and the kitchen responded to her the way it always did, which was to say that it became, in short order, the place it was meant to be. Eggs appeared. Bread went to the toaster, a Muggle toaster that Arthur had acquired several years ago and enchanted to return toast at exactly the right moment, a modification he was quietly proud of. The wireless found the wizarding wireless network and settled there at a low volume, enough for background and not enough for distraction. Harry watched her work. He had thought, more than once over the past week, about what it meant that Molly did what she did. Not in terms of the doing itself, the cooking and organizing and managing, which was visible and constant, but in terms of the fact that she did it every day, for this household, for these people, in this crooked house that required more maintenance
and attention than any reasonable structure had a right to demand. She did it without apparent resentment and without apparent performance. She did it because this was her family, and this was her house, and the one was inseparable from the other. Harry was aware of how much he was inside that fact this summer. How much of what Molly did each morning included him, simply and without ceremony, in the category of people she was doing it for. He found it, still, slightly difficult to sit with directly. Molly turned from the stove to reach for something on the shelf above the sink, and in doing so, her gaze moved across the kitchen, the habitual survey, continuous and automatic, and it passed the windowsill. Harry saw her see it. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second. Her eyes moved to the windowsill and registered the package and moved on, and nothing in her expression changed in any way that would have been detectable to anyone who was not specifically watching. She reached for what she needed on the shelf. She turned back to the stove. She said nothing. Harry looked at the package. He looked at Fred and George. Fred was leaning back in his chair, looking at the ceiling with the expansive ease of someone who has temporarily run out of things to plan and is content to rest between projects. George was examining his own left hand with apparent interest. Neither of them was looking at the windowsill. Neither of them appeared to have noticed that Molly had. Harry had noticed. He sat with this for a moment. The thing he was sitting with was not exactly guilt. Nothing had gone wrong yet. The package had not done anything further. Molly had not asked any questions. But it was adjacent to guilt in the way that knowing something you haven't admitted to is adjacent to lying. Not the same, but not entirely different either. He had been handed something he did not understand, had not asked about it, had moved it when it became inconvenient, rather than resolving the inconvenience properly. And now the person who ran this household had noticed it and said nothing, which was its own kind of pressure. He thought about saying something. He constructed it. "Molly, Fred asked me to hold that. I'm not sure what it is." And measured it against the kitchen, against the smell of eggs now properly cooking, against the sound of the wireless, against the warmth of the morning that had come fully into itself. He said nothing. Breakfast took shape in the way Burrow breakfasts did, not all at once, but in stages, each stage adding something until the table was full enough to eat at, and the eating began before the table was quite finished being set. Ron ate with the focus of someone who has been waiting longer than strictly reasonable. Arthur abandoned his napkin diagram in favor of toast and resumed the plug socket theory in verbal form, which required less space. Fred and George, apparently having arrived at some internal resolution of their earlier conference, were conducting a new conversation, this one at normal volume,
about nothing of significance. The kind of conversation that existed primarily as a vehicle for mutual entertainment. George said something about Lee Jordan. Fred disagreed at length. George ate toast. Ginny came from the window to the table and sat across from Harry, her book closed now, her expression the composed, observant expression she wore when she was paying attention to the room without particularly advertising it. Harry was eating. He was listening to Arthur's theory, which had moved from plug sockets to the broader question of whether Muggle electrical infrastructure could theoretically serve as a transmission network for Owlpost in areas of low owl density. Ron was saying that this seemed unlikely. Arthur was saying that unlikely was not impossible. Fred was saying that this depended entirely on what you were trying to transmit. It was, in all the ways that mattered, a Weasley breakfast. Harry was inside it. He was eating and listening and occasionally contributing, and the morning light was full and golden through the windows now, and he was aware, with the clarity he had been aware of since before anyone else came downstairs, that this was good. That this particular unremarkable morning was better than it had any structural reason to be, simply because of the people in it and the way they were with each other. Then Fred looked toward the windowsill. Harry watched the sequence without being able to prevent any part of it. Fred's gaze moving to the windowsill, Fred's expression shifting through brief recollection to casual action, Fred standing and crossing the kitchen and picking up the package from the windowsill with the unhurried ease of someone collecting something that belongs to them, turning it over once in his hand and returning to the table. He set it in his lap. George glanced at it. Something passed between them, the fraction of a second exchange that served as their full conversational register when necessary. George returned to his toast. Molly was at the stove with her back to the table. She did not turn. The package was no longer on the windowsill. It had not done anything. The morning had not been interrupted. There was nothing left to see. Harry ate his eggs. He was aware, in a way he had not been before Fred collected the package, that the shape of the morning had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way the room would be able to notice, but he felt it. The shadow that had entered at the edge of it when the package first hummed was still there, and he had done nothing to address it. And Fred's easy retrieval of the parcel had simply tidied it away, placed it back out of sight. The morning looked exactly as it had before. Harry knew it was not. Breakfast at the Burrow was not a quiet affair. It never had been, in Harry's experience. And this morning, despite its unusual beginning, despite the stillness that had held the kitchen in the early hour before anyone came downstairs, was not going to be the exception. The table was full now, and full tables in this household operated at a particular frequency, a layered, overlapping noise that was not chaotic exactly, but was certainly never organized. Conversations running parallel to each other and occasionally intersecting. Someone always in the process of reaching across someone else, the wireless providing a low, continuous underscore to all of it. Harry ate and listened and felt the warmth of it settle over him like something physical. Ron had returned, with renewed energy, to the subject of the gnomes. The point, he was saying, gesturing with his fork in the direction of the garden, is that there's no point. You denome the garden, they come back. You denome it again, they come back again. It's futile, is what it is. We should just let them have it. You can't let gnomes have the garden, Ron, Ginny said. They eat the roots. They eat everything, Ron said. Let them eat it. Let them have the whole thing. Declare a formal surrender and move on. The carrots would be gone in a week, Molly said from the stove without turning. We could buy carrots,
Ron said. The silence that followed this suggestion was of the particular quality that indicated the suggestion had not been received as the practical proposal Ron appeared to believe it was. Arthur looked at his son with mild interest. Ginny looked at him with the expression she reserved for ideas that did not survive contact with basic scrutiny. Molly said nothing, which was its own complete response. "From a shop," Ron said, apparently under the impression that the problem was clarity. "Ronald," Molly said. "Ryan," Ron said. "Never mind." Fred said, without looking up from his
plate. Brilliant tactical thinking, that.
Decades of Weasley gnome management finally solved. Buy carrots. "We could put it on a plaque," George said, "in the garden as a memorial." "A memorial to the carrots," Fred said. "To the carrots," George agreed. Ron threw a piece of toast at George. George caught it without looking, which was the sort of thing Fred and George did that Harry had never entirely worked out. Whether it was reflexes or anticipation or something that came from spending your entire life in close proximity to someone who thought the way you did. Arthur was laughing. It was a quiet laugh. Arthur's laugh was always quiet, contained, as though he found things genuinely funny but felt that laughing too loudly about it might somehow diminish the thing. He laughed at the toast incident and at Ron's expression and at the plaque proposal, and his face in the morning light was the face of a man who was, at this moment, entirely and without reservation happy to be exactly where he was. Harry watched him and felt something move through him. Not quite longing, not quite joy. Something that occupied the space where the two met and had not yet resolved into either. The conversation moved, the way Weasley conversations always moved, without any particular plan. From gnomes to the question of whether gnomes had ever been successfully domesticated anywhere in Britain, which Arthur knew the answer to, and Ron did not want to know, to Fred's suggestion that a domesticated gnome would be ideal for certain joke product testing purposes, which Molly addressed with a single look, to the general subject of the World Cup. This last topic arrived the way large topics sometimes arrive in a conversation, not introduced exactly, but present suddenly, having apparently been waiting just outside the room for the right moment to come in. It was Arthur who brought it in, without quite meaning to, in the middle of reaching for more toast. 4 days, he said, to no one in particular. Ron's head came up. 4 days, he confirmed, with the energy of someone who's also been conducting this countdown and is gratified to have it verified by an independent source. "I've sorted the port key," Arthur said. "It's the boot up on Stoatshead Hill, before sunrise, so we'll need to be up early." "How early?" Ginny asked. "Early," Arthur said, which in the Weasley household was a unit of time that could mean almost anything, but in the context of Arthur's expression meant something that would require meaningful sacrifice. "Dad," Fred said. "Very early," Arthur said. "How very?" George said. Arthur named the time. Ron made a sound that was not quite a word. Fred and George exchanged the glance. Ginny looked out the window with the expression of someone filing this information away without reacting to it. Harry felt the 4 days land in him differently from how they landed in the others, with a weight that was not dread, nothing as simple as dread, but a kind of heightened awareness. The awareness of someone who understands that something large is approaching and is not entirely certain what it will feel like to arrive at it. He had never been to the Quidditch World Cup. He had barely been to any large wizarding gathering. The World Cup was something else entirely, a scale he had no reference for. Tens of thousands of witches and wizards in one place, magic functioning in the open air without concealment.
He was aware that he wanted it very much. He was also aware, in the quiet and private part of himself, that wanting things very much had a history of preceding complications. But that was 4 days away. This was now. This was the kitchen and the toast and Ron's ongoing grievances about gnomes and Arthur's happiness about a portkey boot on a hill before sunrise. And Harry looked around the table and let the wanting of it settle without qualification. It was after the toast that the morning found its best version of itself. It happened the way the best versions of things happen, not as an event, but as an arrival, something that was simply there when you looked for it. Molly sat down. This was the thing. She finished at the stove and poured her own tea and pulled out her chair and sat. And the kitchen adjusted itself to this without comment. She drank her tea and listened to Arthur explain his plug socket theory for what was, by Harry's conservative estimate, at least the third time that morning. And her expression as she listened was not the expression of someone hearing something they have heard many times before. It was the expression of someone watching someone they love be interested in something. Harry noticed this. He noticed it and held it carefully. The way you hold something you are not sure you have the right to hold. Not now, certain it was meant for him to see. But Molly did not appear to be performing it for anyone. She was simply sitting at her kitchen table on a summer morning, looking at her husband, who was explaining electricity to their children and to the boy who spent summers with them because he had nowhere better to be. And she looked at all of it with an expression that Harry could only describe inadequately as love. Not the dramatic love of difficult moments, not the fierce protective love that Harry had seen from her at other times, but the ordinary, durable love of someone who has chosen a life and finds on a random morning in late July that they are glad of the choice. Harry looked at his plate. He was aware that his throat was doing something he had not asked it to do. He ate his eggs and did not look at Molly again for a moment, and the kitchen continued. Ron arguing about gnomes with no expectation of resolution, Fred and George back in their low conference now that Molly was seated and the risk profile had changed. Arthur gesturing at the napkin diagram, Ginny refilling her tea at the stove with the quiet self-sufficiency she brought to most things. It was, Harry thought, the most ordinary morning he had ever been inside. He could not think of a morning he had valued more. The shadow was still there. He was aware of it even now. The particular awareness of something unresolved, the thing he carried that none of them knew he was carrying. The package was in Fred's lap, or in Fred's pocket, or wherever Fred had put it, and Molly had seen it on the windowsill and said nothing, and Harry had said nothing, and the morning had continued undisturbed. Nothing had gone wrong. The day was fine. The eggs were good, and the tea was hot, and the light through the windows was warm, and everything was, by any reasonable measure, well. And yet, he looked at Ginny. She was drinking her tea, both hands around the mug, looking at her father's napkin diagram with an expression of tolerant interest. She was not looking at Harry. She had not been looking at Harry specifically for the last several minutes, had simply been present in the kitchen, the way she was always present, with the easy self-possession of someone who takes up exactly the space they need, and no more. But Harry was aware, with the particular awareness you develop for the people who have been honest with you, that she knew. She had said it already. Whatever Fred gave you, you should have asked what it was. She had said it and moved on, and had not made anything more of it. And the morning had absorbed the comment and continued. And that should have been sufficient. He had heard it. He had not forgotten it. It sat in him, alongside the other things he had not resolved, part of the same accumulation. Harry looked at the napkin diagram. Arthur was explaining the proposed location of the rubber tubing. Ron was asking
whether rubber tubing was a real muggle thing or whether Arthur had invented it. Arthur was saying it was entirely real. Fred was suggesting, from across the table, that if it was entirely real, then Arthur had probably tried to buy some, and Arthur's expression at this suggestion was the expression of a man who was about to confirm something he had previously chosen not to mention. Harry almost smiled. He looked around the table, at all of them, at this family, at this table, on this morning, and tried to fix it. Not as a conscious act, nothing so deliberate as that. More like the instinct you have when something is very good, and you are aware that it will not hold indefinitely, that mornings end, and tables empty, and the quality of a particular hour cannot be kept past the hour itself. He wanted to keep it anyway. He thought, I will remember this. And then, immediately, more quietly, I almost made it smaller than it was. Not through any dramatic failure. Not through anything the room would ever know about. Just through the small, accumulated choices of a morning. The things not asked, the things not said. The package moved from one surface to another when returning it would have been more honest. None of it had ruined anything. All of it had cost something. Harry ate the last of his eggs and listened to Arthur triumphantly confirm that yes, he had indeed attempted to source rubber tubing from a Muggle hardware shop in Hertfordshire, and the table responded to this with the noise it deserved. The morning held its warmth and its light and its particular irreplaceable quality, and Harry sat inside it and accepted what it was, which was very good, and what he had done with part of it, which was not. Both things were true. He could sit with both. The morning ended the way mornings at the Burrow always ended, not with any single moment of conclusion, but gradually, in stages. The table emptying by degrees as people finished and moved and the kitchen returned, piece by piece, to its between-meal self. Fred and George went first. They stood together, carried their plates to the sink with the brief efficiency of people who have somewhere to be and have been here long enough. And then Fred said something to George in the low register, and George nodded once, and they were gone. Back up the stairs, their footsteps on the landing already resuming the overlapping rhythm of two people in the middle of a project. Harry watched them go and noticed that Fred's hand, as he pushed back his chair, had gone briefly to his pocket. The pocket where the package presumably now lived. The gesture was absent-minded, habitual. The gesture of someone checking that something is still there. The package was still there. Of course it was. Harry looked at his empty plate. Ron, having exhausted the gnome debate to his own dissatisfaction, announced that he was going to find his Chudley Cannon's book, which he had last seen somewhere in the vicinity of the sitting room, and which he suspected Fred and George had moved as a specific act of malice. He pushed back from the table and disappeared through the kitchen door, his footsteps retreating down the hallway, with the weighted purposefulness of someone conducting an investigation they expect to confirm their worst suspicions. Ginny brought her mug to the sink. She stood at the sink for a moment, rinsing it, looking out the window above it at the garden. The gnomes were gone, had been gone for the last 20 minutes, retreated to whatever subterranean arrangement they had made for themselves under the compost heap, conducting their incomprehensible gnome business in the dark. The garden was still in the late morning light, the long grass catching it, the vegetable patch looking, from this distance, entirely peaceful, all evidence of gnome occupation temporarily invisible. She dried, her hands on the towel by the sink. She did not look at Harry as she passed the table on her way to the door, but she paused
briefly, for just a moment, at the edge of the table nearest him, and she said, without particular emphasis and without stopping, "Whatever Fred gave you, you should have asked what it was." Then she was gone. The door swung softly on its hinges behind her and settled back into the frame, and the kitchen was quiet again. Quieter than it had been since before anyone came downstairs. Quieter even than that first silence Harry had sat in before the morning began. Arthur and Molly remained. They remained the way people remain when a table is emptied and neither of them is moved. Not from inertia, but from the particular contentment of two people who have been in the same kitchen together long enough that staying requires no justification. Arthur had found a fresh piece of parchment. The napkin, pushed to the edge of the door table, had apparently reached the limit of its capacity and was making additional notes, the pencil moving steadily. Molly was finishing her tea, both hands around the mug, the wireless still low in the background. They were not talking. They did not appear to need to. Harry sat across the table from Arthur's notes and beside the space Ron had vacated and felt the kitchen around him. Felt it, specifically, in the way he'd felt it all morning, with the heightened attention of someone who understands he is inside something worth attending to. The light was full now, proper mid-morning light, coming through the south window in a broad, warm panel that reached the middle of the table and stopped. The dried herbs on the ceiling beams cast thin shadows. The enormous pot above the stove gleamed dully. He should get up. There was no reason to sit here any longer. The meal was finished. The table was mostly empty. Getting up was the natural next thing, carrying his plate, the sink, as Fred and George had done, as Ginny had done, and then moving through the door into whatever the rest of the morning became. He sat. He was not ready yet to leave this room. He knew this with a clarity that was slightly embarrassing and that he had no intention of examining too directly. He was 14 years old and he had just had breakfast with a family that was not his. And he was not ready yet to leave the kitchen where it had happened. And that was the complete truth of the matter. Molly looked up from her tea. "All right, Harry," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "Thank you. Breakfast was... thank you." Molly smiled, not the broad, warm smile she deployed for large occasions, but something smaller and more direct. The smile of someone who has heard what you meant as well as what you said. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "You never need to thank me." Harry nodded. He looked at the table. Arthur, without looking up from his parchment, said, 4 days. Molly said, "Arthur." "I'm just saying," Arthur said. "You've been saying it all morning." "Because it's true all morning." Molly looked at her husband with an expression that had several things in it at once: mild exasperation and genuine amusement, and something underneath both of those that was not available for general inspection. "Go and put some proper clothes on," she said. "I'm working," Arthur said. "You're in a jumper with a hole in the elbow." "The elbow doesn't affect the theory." Harry was smiling before he could decide not to. He looked at his plate so that neither of them would see it, which was unnecessary because neither of them was looking at him. But the instinct was there anyway. The instinct, old and persistent, of someone who had learned early that visible emotion in a kitchen was information that could be used against you. He was working on that. He carried his plate to the sink. He did it simply, without ceremony, the way Ginny had done it. Stood, picked up the plate, crossed the kitchen, set the plate in the sink. He ran the tap briefly, the way he had seen Molly do it. He turned the tap off. He stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the window at the garden. The gnomes were still absent. The garden was just a garden in the morning light, imperfect, slightly overgrown in places, the vegetable patch doing what vegetable patches do in the absence of immediate attention, the long grass at the edges doing what long grass does when no one has decided what to do about it yet. It was not a tidy garden. It was not trying to be. It was a garden that belonged to a family with many things to do and a cheerful attitude toward the things that went undone. Harry looked at it and thought about the package. He thought about it directly this time, not with the sideways attention he had been giving it all morning, not keeping it at the edge of his vision where it couldn't quite focus. He let it come to the center. He had been handed something he did not understand. He had not asked what it was. He had held it while it hummed twice, had moved it when it became inconvenient, rather than doing the clearer thing. And then Fred had collected it, and it was gone, and the morning had continued, as though none of it had happened. And in one sense, none of it had happened. Nothing had gone wrong. Nothing had been damaged. No one had been hurt. The day was fine. But Ginny had said, "You should have asked what it was." Not as a reprimand, not with heat, just as a fact, placed carefully in the space between them and left there without embellishment. The same way she had said, "That's not the same as knowing what it is." Quiet, direct, not requiring a response. He had not responded. He had not responded. Because she was right. And when someone is right about something you have already understood to be true, the only honest response is acknowledgement. And acknowledgement felt, in the moment, like too large a thing to produce in a kitchen full of people and a morning he was trying to hold intact. So he had said nothing. He stood at the sink now, looking at the garden, and acknowledged it to himself instead, privately, without the kitchen as witness. He had been handed something by people he trusted, which was reasonable. He had not asked what it was, which was not. He had held it while it demonstrated that it was not inert, which was at best incautious. He had moved it from one surface to another as a substitute for actually dealing with it, which was a kind of avoidance dressed up as action. He had been worried, somewhere underneath all of it, that asking would interrupt something, that asking would make him the person who introduced complication into a morning that was, up to that point, uncomplicated and good, which was true, and also not sufficient. He thought about the ministry papers, security assessment, preliminary notes. He had looked away from them and had felt at the time that looking away was the right thing. And perhaps it was. They were not his papers. The information was not for him, and the looking away had not cost anyone anything. But he was aware now, standing at the sink in the late of the morning, that he had felt a small private pride in not reading, had felt that it was a choice he had made, which was true, but had not felt the other part of it, which was that he had still read the heading, had still absorbed the words, "Large-scale outdoor gatherings, summer 1994. Had still turned that phrase over in his mind without telling Arthur that he had done so. He had looked away from the papers, but had kept what he had already seen. That was also a kind of choice. None of these were large things. This was the part he kept returning to, not with absolution, but simply as fact. None of these were large things. The morning was still good. The family was still here. In 4 days, there would be a World Cup and a portkey that was a boot on a hill before sunrise. And Arthur was still in the kitchen behind him, explaining his theory to Molly, who was pretending to be less interested in it than she was. And all of that was still true. But the morning was smaller than it could have been. Not ruined, not diminished in any way another person would be able to measure, just smaller, reduced by the small weight of the things he had carried through it without putting down. He dried his hands on the towel. He turned from the sink and stood in the kitchen for a moment, not quite ready to go upstairs, and not quite willing to sit back down. The room was warm. The wireless played something low and inconclusive. Arthur was writing. Molly had begun, without apparent transition, to do something organized near the far end of the table, sorting or planning or the particular combination of both that she seemed to conduct simultaneously and without effort. Harry looked at the kitchen. He looked at it the way he had looked at it in the early morning quiet before anyone came downstairs, with the full attention of someone who is aware that he is inside something he values and wants to hold correctly. The table, with its accumulated texture of meals and napkin diagrams and half-finished teas. The clock at the top of the stairs that could not be seen from here but could be known. All hands pointing home. All of them. The herbs on the beams, the mismatched mugs, the south window and the garden beyond it. He thought, I will remember this. He'd thought it before, during breakfast, and the thought was the same now, but weighted differently. Not,
Just this was good. Though it had been. But this was good, and I want to be the kind of person who is worthy of it. Not in any grand sense, not with any ambition larger than the morning, just worthy of the particular ordinary goodness of a family that had made room for him in it, and of the kitchen that had held that goodness for one unremarkable summer morning in late July. Worthy of it meant asking when he was handed something he didn't understand. Worthy of it meant not keeping what he'd glimpsed and staying quiet about having glimpsed it. Worthy of it meant not choosing the comfort of a good morning over the small honesty a good morning deserved. He had not done those things today. He had done other things instead. Quieter things, smaller things, things that no one in this room had noticed and that had not, in any visible way, cost anything. But he had noticed. And the noticing sat in him with the particular persistence of something that does not intend to leave without being addressed. Next time, he thought. Not as a promise. He had learned enough about himself to distrust promises made in the privacy of his own mind. Promises that were easy to make in the quiet of a kitchen and harder to keep in the moment they were needed. Not a promise, just an intention, a direction. Next time Fred handed him something, he would ask what it was. Next time he read something he wasn't meant to read, he would say so. Next time the choice was between the comfort of the morning and the honesty the morning deserved, he would choose differently. He did not know if he would manage it. He thought he might not, the first time or the second. Old habits were durable things, and he had a great many of them. And most of them had been built by years of living in a house where asking questions was not safe, and keeping things to yourself was the only reliable protection you had. But the Burrow was not. Privet Drive. He had known this. He had known it since the first summer he spent here, had felt it as a physical fact, had been grateful for it in ways he had never fully articulated even to himself.
The Burrow was not a house that needed him to be small. It was not a house that rewarded his silence or his invisibility or his practiced art of not taking up space. It was a house where people asked questions and argued about gnomes and explained their theories on napkins and carried books to breakfast and handed each other things across the table and asked, simply and without ceremony, "All right, Harry?" He could ask things here. He could say things here. He could be the kind of person who, when handed something he didn't understand, looked up and said, "What is this?" And the morning would absorb it, and the family would continue, and nothing would be ruined. He stood in the kitchen and understood this, clearly and without qualification, for perhaps the first time. Outside, one of the gnomes reappeared at the edge of the vegetable patch. It stood in the morning light with its characteristic expression of comprehensive indifference, apparently surveying its territory and finding it adequate. Then it waddled forward and disappeared into the long grass. Harry watched it go. "Ron's going to have something to say about that," Arthur said, without looking up from his parchment. "Ron says something about everything," Molly said. "True," Arthur said, with the quiet fondness of a man who finds this a feature rather than a fault. Harry turned from the window. "I'm going to go up," he said. "Thanks again. For breakfast." "Harry," Molly said in the tone she used for this, the tone that was not quite a reprimand and not quite reassurance, but something that encompassed both. "What did I tell you?" "Right," Harry said. "Sorry." "Don't apologize either," she said. "Just eat." He almost said, "I already ate," and then he looked at Molly Weasley standing at her kitchen table on a summer morning, looking at him with an expression that had no agenda in it and no performance and no requirement. And he did not say it. He just nodded. And she looked at him for a moment longer. The look of someone who sees more than they comment on. And then she turned back to her organizing, and the kitchen continued. Harry walked to the kitchen door. He paused, one hand on the doorframe, not from hesitation, just from the same impulse he'd had all morning. The impulse to stay inside something good for one more moment before it changed. The clock at the top of the stairs, all 9 hands pointing home. He went upstairs.